For years, he was the face of a band that sold out arenas and topped charts around the world. Watkins, the lead singer of Lost Prophets, built a career on polished production, radio-friendly rock, and a loyal international fan base. To the public, he was a charismatic performer, synonymous with commercial success and mainstream visibility. But in 2012, his arrest revealed a reality so profoundly disturbing that it stunned his followers, destroyed his band, and forced the music industry to confront how little it sometimes knows about the individuals it elevates to stardom. Watkins was born in Wales in 1977 and co-founded Lost Prophets in the late 1992. The band achieved mainstream success in the early 2000s, with albums like The Fake Sound of Progress and Start Something, establishing a significant following in the UK, Australia, and North America. Watkins became known for his dynamic stage presence and his ability to shift between aggressive vocals and melodic hooks. As the band's popularity grew, they toured globally, performed at major festivals, and cultivated a dedicated community of fans. His public persona was curated to be stylish and media-friendly, far from the controversial or unpredictable images of other rock frontmen. This carefully managed image gave no indication of the reality hidden from public view. While there were occasional rumors of substance use or erratic behavior, Watkins kept much of his personal life out of the public eye. The band continued to release music and tour for over a decade, with their songs receiving regular radio play and industry recognition. That image, however, fell apart abruptly at the end of 2012. In December of that year, police arrested him following an investigation into illegal content and a series of grave criminal activities. 2 women were also taken into custody in connection with the case. As authorities seized digital evidence, the scale of the offenses began to emerge, leading to intense media attention and a rapid public backlash. Watkins initially denied all allegations, and his legal team attempted to challenge the evidence presented. But as investigators continued to gather material, including messages, recordings, and witness testimony, the case against him became overwhelming. In November 2013, a year after his arrest, he changed his plea to guilty on numerous charges. During the legal proceedings, prosecutors described his actions as calculated, deliberate, and of a nature that shocked even seasoned legal professionals. The sentencing took place in December 2013. Watkins was given a prison term of 35 years, to be followed by an additional period on extended license. The 2 women arrested alongside him were also sentenced for related offenses. In his remarks, the judge stated that the crimes represented a complete betrayal of trust and noted that Watkins's celebrity status had enabled a degree of access and influence. The sentence was reported extensively by media outlets worldwide, becoming a major international news story. The fallout for Lost Prophets was immediate and irreversible. The remaining members issued a public statement expressing their horror, anger, and disbelief, announcing they were cutting all ties and permanently disbanding the group. Their response highlighted the profound sense of betrayal, felt not only by the public but by those closest to him. Fans reacted with shock and disgust, and the band's catalog was pulled from streaming platforms and radio stations. Venues, labels, and former collaborators universally condemned his actions and distanced themselves from the band's name. The case sparked broader questions about how fame can conceal profound private wrongdoing and how individuals can maintain public trust while leading secret lives. Unlike other cases that involved violence or threats, Watkins's conviction led to a complete erasure of his career and a permanent severing of fan loyalty. When a public figure's crimes are so severe that they retroactively taint their art, what is the proper cultural response to that legacy? He was the frontman of a successful metal band, recognized for intense performances and lyrics that often explored themes of aggression and personal struggle. Lambesis, the lead vocalist for As I Lay Dying, had built a reputation as a disciplined musician with a dedicated global fan base. His band toured internationally, released charting albums, and earned a high level of respect within the heavy music scene. But in 2013, his name made headlines for a reason no one could have predicted, one that had nothing to do with music. Timothy Lambesis, born in California in 1980, co-founded As I Lay Dying in the early 2000s. The band rose quickly through the ranks, becoming one of the leading names in the metalcore genre, with commercially successful and critically acclaimed albums like Shadows Are Security and An Ocean Between Us. Lambesis stood out not just for his powerful vocals, but for his commanding stage presence and a seemingly clean-cut public image. As the band toured across Europe, North America, and Australia, they became Grammy nominees and fixtures of their genre. Offstage, Lambesis cultivated an image rooted in physical fitness, philosophy, and what many of his followers assumed were Christian values. Interviews frequently presented him as a focused and disciplined individual, leading fans to see him as someone who balanced an intense stage persona with a serious and grounded personal life. This perception made the events that followed seem all the more shocking. By 2012, his marriage was deteriorating, and his divorce from his wife, with whom he had adopted multiple children, became increasingly contentious. During this period, Lambesis reportedly grew distant from his previously held beliefs, struggled with his identity, and became consumed by frustration over custody arrangements and financial disputes. Behind closed doors, his resentment was escalating into a dangerous mindset. In early 2013, Lambesis spoke to an acquaintance at his gym, expressing a desire to have his estranged wife harmed. This individual promptly contacted law enforcement, who then initiated an undercover operation. An officer, posing as a contract killer, met with Lambesis in a recorded meeting. During this conversation, he allegedly provided instructions, discussed timing, and offered payment to have the plan carried out. On May 7, 2013, authorities arrested him in a retail store in California. The news spread instantly, with headlines about a murder-for-hire plot dominating both music outlets and mainstream media. Fans and his own bandmates were stunned. As I Lay Dying immediately cancelled their scheduled shows, and their public statements reflected a state of complete disbelief. During the court proceedings, prosecutors presented audio recordings and testimony from the undercover operation. Lambesis initially pleaded not guilty, with his defense team arguing that a combination of emotional instability and the use of medications, including steroids, had impaired his judgment. However, the recorded evidence of his actions remained central to the case. In February 2014, he changed his plea to guilty. The court subsequently sentenced him to 6 years in prison for the solicitation of murder. During the sentencing, his wife delivered a statement describing the fear and trauma she experienced upon learning that someone she had once trusted had organized a plan to end her life. The judge's remarks emphasized that planning such an act, even if it is never carried out, is a serious crime that cannot be minimized. The fallout was immediate and widespread. As I Lay Dying disbanded, with the other members starting new projects and distancing themselves from the case. Fans who had once viewed Lambesis as a figure of intensity and integrity struggled to reconcile the artist they admired with the individual who committed the crime. While incarcerated, he reportedly focused on counseling and self-reflection. In late 2016, after serving approximately half of his sentence, he was released on parole. Upon his release, he issued public apologies, acknowledging the gravity of his actions and the profound harm he had caused. In 2018, As I Lay Dying reformed with Lambesis as the vocalist, a decision that generated significant controversy. Some former fans rejected his return entirely, while others accepted the reunion on the condition that he continued to demonstrate genuine accountability. The band released new music and resumed performing, but the shadow of the conviction has remained. The case became a reference point for how personal collapse can lead to decisions that irrevocably alter lives and reputations. When public figures are convicted of serious crimes but later express remorse and fulfill their legal obligations, what is the path forward for public and professional reconciliation, if one should exist at all? He was a respected figure in the extreme metal scene, known more for his musicianship than for theatrics. John Nödtveidt, the founder and frontman of the Swedish band Dissection, earned recognition for helping to shape the melodic black metal sound of the 1990 seconds. But behind the music, ideology and violence intersected in a way that resulted in a homicide, a prison sentence, and a legacy permanently defined by what happened off stage. John Andreas Nödtveidt was born in 1975 and grew up in the town of Strömstad, Sweden. Immersing himself in underground music from an early age, he co-founded Dissection in 1989 as a teenager. The band quickly drew attention for its unique combination of harsh vocals and dark themes with complex, melodic guitar work. Albums like The Somberlane and Storm of the Lightsbane became landmarks in the genre, influencing countless artists in Scandinavia and beyond. Unlike some of his contemporaries who courted publicity through shock value, Nödtveidt maintained a focused and serious public persona. As Dissection toured through Europe, they gained a reputation for delivering both aggression and technical skill. However, his interests extended beyond music. He became involved with a small occult organization that held extremist and violent beliefs rooted in nihilism, elitism, and an anti-human ideology. Over time, these abstract beliefs began to manifest in real-world behavior. In 1997, Nödtveidt and an acquaintance were involved in an incident that resulted in the death of a 37-year-old Algerian man, Youssef Ben Medad, in Gothenburg, Sweden. Reports from the investigation indicated that the attack was motivated, in part, by xenophobic and ideological hostility. Prosecutors argued that the act was not spontaneous, but was targeted and deliberate. The victim sustained fatal gunshot wounds, and the crime shocked a community that was more familiar with Nödtveidt's artistic persona than his private associations. Following the homicide, a police investigation quickly led to arrests. Nödtveidt was taken into custody and subsequently charged for his role in the event. During the trial, he did not deny his involvement. The evidence presented linked him directly to the incident, and in 1998, the court found him guilty of complicity in the murder, sentencing him to 10 years in prison under Swedish law. His accomplice was also convicted. The verdict stunned many within the metal community, as fans who admired his songwriting struggled to reconcile the violent act with the image they held of him. The band effectively dissolved as Nödtveidt began serving his sentence. After his release from prison in 2004, having served approximately 7 years, he almost immediately revived Dissection, announcing new music and performances. The band's return was controversial but drew significant attention. In 2006, they released Reinkaos, an album heavily influenced by the belief system he adhered to, which was largely written during his incarceration. The record marked a musical departure but maintained his reputation for compositional precision. Despite this comeback, many observers sensed his return to music would be short-lived. Interviews from that period revealed a man still deeply committed to the same ideology that predated his conviction, and he rarely addressed the crime itself or expressed public remorse. On August 13, 2006, John Nödtveidt was found deceased in his apartment in Sweden at the age of 31. Authorities concluded that he had taken his own life. Reports indicated that the scene had been arranged with ritualistic elements, and he had left written messages nearby. For some of his supporters, his death was framed as the final act of a belief system he never abandoned. For others, it was the tragic conclusion for an individual who followed a destructive ideology to its darkest outcome. His legacy remains one of the most controversial in metal history, not because of performative shock value, but because his personal convictions led to another person's death and a legal judgment he never denied. When an artist's personal ideology leads directly to violence, can their creative contributions ever be ethically separated from the harm they caused? In the early 1990 seconds, Norway's black metal scene was gaining international notoriety, not just for its sound, but for the ideology and violence brewing beneath its surface. Bård Faust Eithun was the drummer for Emperor, one of the most influential bands in the genre. But in 1992, long before he was widely known to fans. He was responsible for a homicide that remained unsolved for nearly a year before coming to light. Faust, born in 1974, became involved in the black metal scene as a teenager. Emperor, the band he joined in the early 90s, became known for its atmospheric compositions and harsh vocals, paired with symphonic elements. While some bands in the genre presented a theatrical darkness, this particular scene often blurred the line between performance and belief, with members of several groups sharing extreme views and a rejection of mainstream society. On the night of August 21st, 1992, Faust was in Lillehammer, Norway. According to his own later statements, he was in a park when he encountered a man who allegedly approached him. The events that followed were sudden and violent. Faust accompanied the man into a wooded area where he inflicted multiple fatal injuries with a weapon. The motive was never clearly established in court. Some have suggested it was driven by ideology, while others believe it was an impulsive act. Whatever the reason, Faust left the scene and returned to his life as if nothing had occurred. For months, the case went unsolved as investigators had no clear suspects or direct leads. During this time, Faust continued to work with Emperor, recording music and rehearsing for future releases while the band was still an underground act. The broader black metal scene was already attracting negative attention due to a series of church arsons and public controversies, but Faust's involvement in the Lillehammer homicide remained unknown to authorities. This changed in 1993, following the arrest of Varg Vikernes for the death of Øystein Euronymous Arseth. As police delved deeper into the inner circles of the black metal community, rumors and confessions began to surface. Eventually, Faust admitted to the 1992 homicide, surprising investigators who had not previously linked him to the crime. In 1994, Faust went to trial in Norway, where he pleaded guilty to murder. The court considered the nature of the act and sentenced him to 14 years in prison. He ultimately served approximately 9 years before being released on parole, in accordance with Norwegian sentencing guidelines at the time. During his incarceration, Emperor continued for a short period before disbanding for several years, and the entire black metal scene underwent heavy public and legal scrutiny. Faust's name became part of that larger narrative, serving as a reminder that the scene's violent rhetoric had, for some individuals, translated into real-world actions. After his release in 2003, he re-entered the music world, contributing to various metal projects and performing as a guest with other bands, rather than returning to a central role in Emperor. In interviews from that period, he has presented a more detached perspective, acknowledging the crime as something from a different part of his life that cannot be undone, without offering emotional justifications. The homicide he committed is often discussed alongside other incidents from that era, but it stands apart as it was not connected to band rivalries or the church arsons. It was a singular act, carried out in silence and concealed until his own admission brought it to light. When an individual commits a violent act early in their career and later re-enters society after serving a prison sentence, how should their artistic contributions both before and after the crime be contextualized within their personal history? He was less a musician and more of a cultural symbol. Sid Vicious didn't just play bass for the Sex Pistols. He embodied the reckless, self-destructive spirit of the late 1970s punk movement. But behind the snarling persona and the fame built on chaos, a downward spiral was unfolding that would end in one of rock history's most notorious and unresolved cases. Born John Simon Ritchie in London in 1957, Sid Vicious grew up in a fractured environment, marked by his mother's struggles with addiction and a persistent sense of instability throughout his teenage years. He found his place within London's emerging punk scene and formed a friendship with Johnny Rotten long before he joined the Sex Pistols. When the band's original bassist, Glenn Matlock, departed, Sid was brought in not for his musical proficiency, but for his aggressive attitude and iconic look, which perfectly captured the band's ethos. The Sex Pistols became a cultural explosion, generating controversy, band shows, media outrage, and global headlines. Sid quickly became the face of this rebellion, a figure whose notoriety often eclipsed the band's music. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. In 1977, he met Nancy Spungen, an American who was already deeply immersed in music subcultures. Their relationship became intense and all-consuming almost immediately. They were inseparable, caught in a codependent cycle that amplified their shared substance use and accelerated their decline. Bandmates and friends described the pair as volatile, marked by constant conflict, yet they refused to separate. As his dependency worsened, Sid's reliability as a band member vanished. He struggled to perform, missed rehearsals, and was frequently involved in physical altercations. The Sex Pistols' final U.S. tour in early 1978 ended in collapse, and the band dissolved soon after. With the band gone, Sid and Nancy relocated to the Chelsea Hotel in New York City, a landmark known for housing a transient community of artists, writers, and musicians. By October 1978, their existence had narrowed to a life of isolation centered around heroin use. On the morning of October 12th, after other residents reported hearing a commotion from their room, Nancy Spungen was found on the bathroom floor. She had sustained a fatal abdominal wound and was only 20 years old. Sid was discovered wandering the hallways, disoriented and heavily under the influence of narcotics. Police arrested him and charged him with second-degree murder. His initial statements to authorities were reportedly inconsistent. At times, he seemed to deny any involvement, while at others, he suggested he may have been responsible but had no memory of the event. Investigators found no signs of forced entry, and the room contained clear evidence of extensive drug use. Because both individuals were known to have been heavily intoxicated, establishing a precise chain of events proved difficult. Some friends claimed other people had visited the room that night, but these leads never resulted in a confirmed alternative suspect. Sid was released on bail while awaiting trial. His legal team prepared to argue that the case was far from straightforward, pointing to the lack of witnesses, the absence of a weapon conclusively tied to him, and his state of intoxication, which made any timeline or memory unreliable. While the investigation continued, he attempted to restart his career as a solo act, but his addiction remained uncontrolled. Just weeks after his release, he was arrested again for assaulting singer Patti Smith's brother, Todd Smith, with a broken bottle at a nightclub. This incident resulted in his incarceration at Rikers Island for nearly 2 months. By early 1979, he was out on bail once more. On February 2nd, at the age of 21, he was found deceased from a heroin overdose. Reports later emerged that his mother had supplied the narcotics, leading to speculation about the circumstances of his death. Some believe he had been attempting to quit and relapsed with a dose his body could no longer handle. His death occurred before any trial for Nancy Spungen's case could take place, leaving her death legally unresolved. For decades, the case has remained a subject of intense speculation. Some theorize it was a tragic accident that occurred during a drug-fueled argument. Others maintain that a third party entered the room, possibly to rob them, and was responsible for the incident. With no conviction ever handed down, the matter is still considered an open question by many. Sid's legacy became a cautionary tale about the grim reality behind a romanticized punk ideal of living on the edge. His name is now inextricably linked to the unresolved circumstances surrounding Nancy's death, making him a tragic emblem of self-destruction. In a case where the line between a manufactured public persona and a private individual is completely blurred, how can we ever truly determine responsibility when a real-world tragedy occurs? For much of the 2000s, Jacob Hoggard was known as a television personality who transitioned into a successful rock frontman. As the lead singer of the Canadian band Hedley, he built a career on high-energy music, pop rock anthems, and a carefully crafted public image. But years after topping charts and touring internationally, he became the subject of serious allegations that dismantled his career and culminated in a criminal conviction. Hoggard, born in British Columbia in 1984, first rose to national fame in 2004 as a finalist on the television show Canadian Idol. He leveraged that exposure to launch his band, Headley, into mainstream recognition. Throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s, the group achieved significant success, releasing platinum-selling albums, selling out arena tours, and collecting major awards in Canada. Their songs were staples on national radio, and Hoggard became a regular presence in entertainment media, often perceived as impulsive and flashy, but not as a threat. However, by the mid-2010s, reports about Hoggard's offstage behavior began to surface. Concerns, initially circulating anonymously online, described interactions that raised questions about boundaries and consent. These early warnings gained little traction in traditional media until 2018, when multiple women came forward publicly with detailed allegations. The accusations described a pattern of conduct in which women were contacted through social media or after concerts and invited to meet him privately in hotels or backstage. Several alleged that once they were alone with him, he acted aggressively and disregarded their objections. As more accounts emerged, the fallout for Headley was swift and severe. Radio stations across Canada pulled their music from rotation, venues cancelled upcoming shows, and the band withdrew from scheduled performances. Within months, the remaining members announced an indefinite hiatus. In 2018, police launched a formal investigation. After reviewing statements, digital correspondence, and evidence from multiple complainants, authorities charged Hoggard with offenses involving 2 individuals. By the time the case went to court, allegations from additional women had been examined by authorities, some of which were used in legal proceedings to help establish a pattern of behavior. The trial began in Toronto in 2022. The courtroom heard testimony detailing his conduct during specific encounters, which prosecutors argued involved coercion and resulted in intentional harm. In his defense, Hoggard maintained that all interactions were consensual, suggesting that the culture of fame and touring had blurred perceptions. His legal team pointed to inconsistencies in some accounts, but the prosecution presented a case built on timelines, messages, and witness statements. In June 2022, the jury delivered a partial verdict. Jacob Hoggard was found guilty of sexual assault causing bodily harm against 1 woman. He was acquitted on 2 other counts involving separate complainants. Following the verdict, the judge ordered him into custody. In October 2022, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The court acknowledged his lack of a prior criminal record, but emphasized the seriousness of the offense and the harm caused. Although he was later granted supervised release while his legal team pursued an appeal, the conviction remained in place. The public reaction was decisive. Radio stations have continued to keep his music off their playlists, and former fans have distanced themselves from his work. The case became a focal point in public conversations across Canada about power, celebrity, and accountability, particularly how fame can shield misconduct until a tipping point is reached. The remaining members of Headley have spoken about the situation only sparingly, officially dissolving the band and walking away from its legacy. Today, Jacob Hoggard's name is no longer associated with radio hits or televised performances, but with a conviction that came after years of rumors that were, for a long time, dismissed or ignored. When allegations against a public figure circulate for years within fan communities and online spaces, what does it reveal about the systems that allow such behavior to continue unchecked until it results in formal legal consequences? In the early 1990s, a dark and theatrical music scene in Norway produced one of the most controversial figures in modern metal history. Varg Vikernes, born Christian Vikernes, became known not just for his musical project Burzum or his brief association with the band Mayhem, but for his connection to a death that shocked the international music community and for acts of destruction that targeted historical sites across Norway. Growing up in Bergen, Vikernes entered the emerging black metal scene as a teenager. The genre was defined by its raw, aggressive sound and its deliberate opposition to mainstream culture. Bands like Mayhem gained notoriety not only for their music but for cultivating an atmosphere of provocation and secrecy. Vikernes started Burzum as a solo project, recording all the instruments himself. While his music was gaining attention within the underground, the events happening around him would soon overshadow any of his artistic output. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. His association with Mayhem was initially informal, but he became a part of the band's inner circle, a group of individuals who shared strong anti-establishment views and a fascination with extremist ideologies. For some within this circle, these ideas began to transition from stage personas and interviews into real-world actions. By 1992, several historic wooden churches across Norway were destroyed by fire. Initially, authorities were uncertain who was responsible, but rumors soon connected members of the black metal scene to the incidents. Vikernes was eventually arrested and later convicted for his role in the arson of multiple churches, including the Fantoft Stave Church, a structure that had stood for nearly 900 years before it was completely destroyed. The destruction drew international media attention and amplified the perception that a violent ideology was developing within the genre. However, the church arsons were only a prelude to a far more serious event. Tensions between Vikernes and Øystein, Euronymous Arseth, Mayhem's guitarist and a central figure in the scene, had been escalating. Observers have described the conflict as a power struggle, while others point to financial disputes or ideological rivalries as the root cause. On August 10, 1993, Vikernes traveled from Bergen to Oslo and went to Arseth's apartment. When authorities arrived, Arseth was found deceased, having sustained multiple fatal injuries. Authorities apprehended Vikernes quickly. He maintained that he acted in self-defense, claiming he believed Arseth intended to harm him. However, the prosecution argued that the evidence pointed to a premeditated attack. During the trial, the court rejected his self-defense claim. He was ultimately convicted of murder, alongside the charges related to the church arsons and the possession of explosives. In May 1994, he received what was then Norway's maximum sentence, 21 years in prison. The case captured widespread attention, both in Scandinavia and globally. The media portrayed the black metal scene as a violent, cult-like subculture, with Vikernes as the central figure in that narrative. His name was repeatedly used as an example of how the genre's rhetoric had manifested in real-world violence. Even after his conviction, he remained a controversial voice, granting interviews and writing from prison on topics of ideology, religion, and identity that drew further backlash. His public image became deeply polarized. Some supporters framed him as a figure of artistic rebellion, while others saw him as a convicted individual whose notoriety was undeserved. After serving 16 years, he was granted parole in 2009. He later moved to France, shifting his public focus to writing and internet commentary. While he occasionally released music under the Burzum name, his criminal history has permanently overshadowed it. His case stands out because it involved both ideological violence against cultural symbols and an act of interpersonal violence that ended in a death. Today, his name still sparks debate, with many refusing to separate his music from his actions, while others discuss the influence he had on black metal's darker legacy. At what point does provocative artistic expression cross the line from performance into a genuine catalyst for destructive real-world action? He was once a glitter-covered icon of glam rock, a performer known for platform boots, theatrical outfits, and chart-topping anthems that filled arenas. Gary Glitter, born Paul Francis Gadd in 1944, built a career in the 1,970 seconds that made him a household name in the UK and beyond. His songs became staples at sporting events, on television, and in clubs around the world. But behind the elaborate stage persona and celebrity status, he maintained a hidden life that would ultimately dismantle his legacy and result in multiple prison sentences. Glitter achieved widespread fame with hits like Rock and Roll, Part 2, and I'm the Leader of the Gang, I Am, becoming a central figure in the glam rock era. His outrageous costumes, distinct vocal style, and swaggering stage presence cultivated a larger-than-life image. For a time, he was considered one of Britain's most successful entertainers, and he continued to tour and make television appearances into the 1,980 seconds, living off the recognition his early fame had secured. Few could have suspected that his offstage conduct would eventually eclipse his entire career. The first public fracture of his image occurred in 1997. A computer he had taken to a repair shop in England was found to contain illegal material depicting the sexual exploitation of minors. This discovery prompted a police investigation that led to his arrest. In 1999, he was convicted in the UK for the possession of indecent material and served a short prison sentence. At the time, some may have viewed it as an isolated incident or a fall from grace from which he might recover. Instead, it was only the beginning of a long series of legal consequences. After his release, Glitter left the UK and traveled extensively throughout Southeast Asia, residing in countries such as Cambodia and Vietnam. His movements drew suspicion, and authorities in multiple nations began to monitor him. In 2005, he was arrested by Vietnamese police following accusations involving young girls. The local investigation uncovered evidence of serious offenses, and he was ultimately convicted and sentenced to prison. He served nearly 3 years before being deported back to the UK in 2008. By this point, his name had become synonymous with criminal disgrace rather than musical achievement. Many believed this chapter marked the end of his legal troubles, but it did not. In 2012, as part of Operation U-Tree, a large-scale British investigation into historical abuse cases, authorities questioned him again. This inquiry brought forward multiple individuals with allegations dating back to the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds during the height of his fame. In 2015, he stood trial in London on numerous charges involving girls who were minors at the time of the offences. Prosecutors presented testimony and evidence that revealed a pattern of exploitation committed while he was touring and performing. The trial concluded with a guilty verdict, and the court sentenced him to 16 years in prison. In his sentencing remarks, the judge stated that Glitter had used his fame and influence to exploit the vulnerability of others. The verdict made international news, and the music industry took further steps to distance itself from him. Radio stations removed his songs from their rotations, sporting venues dropped his tracks from their playlists, and television reruns featuring him were edited or removed from circulation entirely. The case raises an important question about an artist's cultural footprint. Even decades after his last hit, his music had remained in the public sphere, but the gravity of his convictions led broadcasters and sponsors to sever all association. His career was, in effect, publicly erased. In 2023, he was briefly released on license, but was recalled to prison shortly after for violating the conditions of his release, demonstrating the intense scrutiny he remains under. Gary Glitter's downfall is a stark example of a fall from arenas and televised performances to prison cells across continents. His record, spanning multiple convictions in different countries, serves as a prominent case study in conversations about celebrity power, exploitation, and long-delayed accountability. How should society navigate the legacy of an artist when their personal actions are found to be fundamentally at odds with the joy their art once brought to the public? He was the recognizable frontman of one of the biggest rock bands of the 1,980 seconds. To his audience, Vince Neil was a figure known for a high energy and fearless stage presence. But on a December night in 1984, that persona and lifestyle collided with reality in an incident that would leave permanent consequences. Vince Neil, born in California, rose to prominence as the lead singer of Motley Crue, a band whose identity was built on excess, fast cars, and a lifestyle lived at full volume. By his early 20 seconds, He was performing in sold-out arenas, earning millions, and living with a public image that revolved around adrenaline and rebellion. Many around him understood the volatile nature of this lifestyle, but few could have predicted the tragic outcome it would lead to. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to be the first to receive notifications when there are new videos. On December 8th, 1984, Vince was at his home in Redondo Beach when his friend, Nicholas Razzle Dingley, came to visit. Razzle was the drummer for the Finnish rock band Hanoi Rocks, and his group was in town for performances and studio sessions. The gathering had already involved alcohol when the two decided to leave and drive to a nearby liquor store. Despite having been drinking for hours, Vince took the wheel of his red 1972 De Tomaso Pantera. The streets were narrow and residential, and he was traveling at a high speed. While returning, Vince lost control of the vehicle, swerving into oncoming traffic and colliding head-on with another car. The resulting collision was devastating. Razzle, who was in the passenger seat, sustained fatal injuries and was later pronounced dead at the hospital. The two occupants of the other vehicle were seriously injured and suffered long-term health effects, while Vince himself sustained only minor injuries. The consequences of his decision were irreversible. Law enforcement determined his blood alcohol level was significantly over the legal limit. He was subsequently arrested and charged with vehicular manslaughter and driving while intoxicated. The news sent shockwaves through the rock community. Fans were stunned, fellow musicians were in disbelief, and the media widely covered the story. For years, a culture of reckless behavior had been associated with rock stars, often without major repercussions. This time, however, a life was lost, and others were permanently harmed. The legal process moved forward swiftly. Prosecutors presented the facts: a high-speed collision, severe injuries to multiple victims, and the death of Razzle. Vince entered a guilty plea rather than proceeding to a trial. The court sentenced him to 30 days in jail, though he ultimately served less than half of that time due to early release programs. He was also ordered to pay approximately $2.5 million in restitution, complete community service, and attend alcohol-related counseling. The sentence immediately generated controversy. Many people believed his celebrity status afforded him a level of leniency that an ordinary person would not have received. Critics argued that despite the tragic loss of life and the severe injuries sustained by others, Vince spent only a short period incarcerated. While the families involved accepted the legal outcome, the public debate over the fairness of the sentence would follow him for years. When he returned to public life, Vince attempted to take responsibility for his actions, but he reportedly struggled to change his lifestyle. The tragedy became a recurring topic in interviews, documentaries, and the band's official history. Even as Mötley Crüe continued to release albums and tour, the incident cast a long shadow over their success. Bandmates have stated that the event marked a turning point, not just for Vince, but for how the industry viewed extreme behavior. Over time, he expressed remorse for what happened, explaining that he lives with the knowledge that his actions led to the death of a friend. Yet, he continued to face criticism for subsequent legal issues related to alcohol in later years. Each new headline served as a reminder of the past, and his 1984 sentencing was often revisited in discussions about accountability and celebrity justice. Today, Vince Neil remains active in music and is a well-known figure from the glam metal era. But no matter how many years pass, the events of that December night remain an indelible part of his legacy. It stands as a somber case study of fame colliding with consequence, illustrating how a single choice can permanently alter the course of several lives. When an artist's public persona is built on rebellion and excess, where does personal accountability begin when that image leads to real-world tragedy? He was known as the steady, foundational presence in one of the world's most recognizable rock bands. while the rest of AC, divided by DC, captured the spotlight with powerful guitars, anthems, and high-energy performances. Phil Rudd established his legacy from the back of the stage. He was perceived as quiet, controlled, and essential to the band's sound. However, long after the peak of his fame, the public perception of the reserved drummer unraveled in a way that surprised many long-time observers. Born in 1954 inches, Melbourne, Australia, Phil Rudd developed his skills in local bands before joining AC divided by DC in the mid-1970s. He was the rhythmic force behind some of their most defining albums, including High Voltage, Let There Be Rock, Highway to Hell, and Back in Black. His drumming style was not characterized by flashy solos or theatrics, but by a simple, heavy, and perfectly timed groove that powered entire stadiums. This on-stage discipline seemed to mirror his off-stage persona. He rarely pursued headlines or interviews and was often viewed as the most grounded member of a group known for its chaotic energy. But beneath the surface, personal struggles and internal band tensions led to his temporary departure in the early 1980s. He relocated to New Zealand, launched businesses, and stepped away from the international spotlight. When he rejoined AC divided by DC in 1994, it marked a quiet comeback. For the next 2 decades, he toured with them and contributed to major albums, including Rock or Bust. To most of the public, it appeared he had successfully navigated the pressures of the rock and roll lifestyle without the public breakdowns that affected other artists. That perception changed dramatically in 2014, when law enforcement in New Zealand executed a search warrant at his home, following concerning reports. Authorities initially brought forward several allegations, including making threats of serious harm against an individual, possession of controlled substances, and attempting to procure the services of an associate to carry out an act of violence related to a business dispute. While the most serious allegation, that of attempting to arrange for a third party to inflict harm, was later withdrawn by prosecutors due to insufficient evidence, the charges related to verbal threats and drug possession remained. During the search, officers discovered methamphetamine and cannabis. The court proceeded with charges of threatening to cause grievous harm and possession of illegal substances. As details emerged, the case drew significant media attention. Phil Rudd, the typically private member of AC divided by DC, was suddenly the subject of headlines, usually reserved for high-profile criminal cases. The stark contrast between his long-held public image and the nature of the charges was a point of shock for many fans. The investigation suggested the conflict stemmed from a dispute over the handling of Rudd's solo album, which allegedly led him to make threatening statements in an attempt to intimidate others. In response, his legal counsel argued that his actions were the result of significant stress and did not reflect a genuine intent to cause physical harm. The court was then left to consider the evidence, including the drug possession and the perceived seriousness of the threats. In 2015, Rudd entered a guilty plea to the charges. The judge sentenced him to 8 months of home detention under strict monitoring, which also included mandatory participation in a treatment program and abstinence from drugs and alcohol. The sentence, while avoiding prison time, had significant professional repercussions. AC, divided by DC, proceeded with their Rock or Bust world tour by hiring a replacement drummer, publicly distancing themselves from the situation. The story was widely covered internationally, often emphasizing the contrast between his decades of on-stage discipline and the turmoil in his private life. During sentencing, the court noted that his actions had a genuine and distressing impact on the people he threatened. It was determined that, although no physical harm occurred, the seriousness of the intent was sufficient to warrant long-term restrictions and mandatory oversight. Following the conviction, Rudd addressed the case publicly, attributing his behavior to immense pressure and acknowledging that his drug use had become a serious problem. He expressed a commitment to regaining control of his life, mindful of the judge's warning that any violation of his home detention could lead to imprisonment. In the years that followed, Rudd focused on staying out of further legal trouble. Nevertheless, The incident marked an undeniable shift in his public perception. A career once defined by quiet professionalism and rhythmic precision was now also associated with serious legal issues. Though he avoided incarceration, the 2015 conviction permanently altered his path with AC divided by DC and reshaped his legacy. When a public figure maintains a quiet and stable persona for decades, how does that image impact our judgment when their private struggles violently surface? Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Your time, attention, and curiosity are what make this space possible, a place dedicated to examining the most complex, mysterious, and unsettling cases from around the world. Today, we explored facts, testimonies, and theories that challenge not only our understanding of justice, but also our perception of human nature and the systems that sometimes fail to provide answers. What do you think about this case? Do the explanations presented make sense to you, or do you believe there are still hidden truths waiting to be uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective helps enrich this conversation and build a thoughtful community where every opinion counts. Tell us what stood out to you the most, what made you question things, or what moved you personally. If you found this content insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss future uploads. Each week, we bring you new cases, deep investigations, and detailed analyses aimed at understanding what truly lies behind these stories. Thank you for being part of a community that looks beyond headlines and seeks to understand the truth with empathy and critical thinking. We'll see you in the next video with more cases, more analysis, and more truth. Until then, take care and remember, sometimes the truth is closer than it seems.